A four-term U.S. senator with decades of power, endless establishment money, and the deepest political connections in the state doesn't just lose, he gets completely blown out. And it's forcing a massive realization. The old rules of political survival might actually be dead. On paper, you had John Cornyn, an incredibly familiar name with massive influence, facing Ken Paxton in a Republican Senate runoff. It looked like it should be a standard race. But when the votes actually came in, something jumped out immediately.
We're talking exactly 27 percentage points. That is not a narrow margin. It's not a late-night recount situation or a slight upset. It's a complete dismantling. Incumbents usually survive these kinds of challenges, especially people who have been around for decades. So for someone like that to lose this decisively, you have to ask what exactly changed in the electorate. Because the biggest story here isn't necessarily who won. It's the sheer, staggering magnitude of how it happened.
Think about the paradox here. On one side, you have the ultimate traditional armor of a political titan. 4 terms, decades in Washington, wall-to-wall establishment support. For a very long time, those things were absolute guarantees of your political survival. But on the other side, a 27-point defeat. An entrenched incumbent was systematically taken apart by a highly mobilized grassroots insurgency. It totally fractures the assumption that an incumbent advantage is a real, tangible safety net.
And here is where the math gets genuinely wild. Normally, if you massively outspend your opponent blanketing the airwaves with digital and television ads, you win. But Cornyn and his allies spent roughly $90 million. Paxton and his allies, about $10 million. That is a staggering 9-to-1 financial disadvantage. And yet, despite having overwhelming financial superiority, the incumbent didn't just lose, he was crushed. Which forces a deeply uncomfortable question for every campaign strategist out there right now. What actually happens to modern election mechanics when blasting the airwaves with millions of dollars in ads completely fails to move voters? What if people's minds are already made up? Because if pure enthusiasm suddenly matters more than raw spending power, a whole lot of traditional campaign assumptions start falling apart. To figure out how this happened, you have to look at the structural filter of the race. The electorate completely shifted between March and May. Back in the high-turnout March primary, we saw over 2.2 million Republican voters show up. In that broad environment, financial advantages worked, and Cornyn held a narrow lead. But the May runoff? It dropped to about 1.3 million voters. It was a smaller, highly focused, and intensely motivated base of conservative activists. It's no longer about appealing to the broadest audience. It's about who can energize people enough to actually show up on a random Tuesday. And those highly motivated voters split in a way that is mathematically jarring. Out of roughly 924,000 cast runoff ballots, Paxton captured 63.5%, leaving the incumbent sitting at just 36.5%. This wasn't just a slight preference for a new direction. It was a definitive hardline rejection of traditional statesmanship and compromise, completely favoring an uncompromising style of partisan combat. So where did all those votes suddenly come from? The crucial pivot happened with the third-place primary candidate, Wesley Hunt. In March, he captured 13% of the vote. When he was eliminated, those voters didn't split evenly down the middle. They aggressively consolidated behind Paxton. That redistribution triggered a massive net 23-point surge for Paxton, a momentum shift so powerful it completely swallowed up the incumbent's early advantage.
But you can't ignore the late-stage catalyst that accelerated all of this. On May 19th, right as early voting was kicking off, Donald Trump dropped his endorsement for Ken Paxton. Before this happened, polling showed a highly competitive race, sometimes right on the margin of error, but overnight, that endorsement fundamentally altered the trajectory. It really makes you wonder, did that endorsement actually change people's minds, or did it just activate a base that was already looking for a signal?
The endorsement wasn't just a generic stamp of approval either. It was tied directly to a very specific policy flashpoint. Trump publicly castigated Cornyn as disloyal for not fighting hard enough for the Save America Act. Paxton took that and ran with it, showcasing his willingness to completely dismantle traditional Senate norms. While Cornyn was open to maybe suspending the filibuster to pass the bill, Paxton aggressively committed to terminating the filibuster entirely. He even offered to drop out of the race if the Senate passed the bill beforehand. He demanded absolute commitment.
And this is the core of the paradigm shift. The old rules of what makes someone electable, statesmanship, compromise, building consensus, they've been systematically replaced. Today's primary voters are demanding uncompromising combat and absolute loyalty. In this new framework, preserving institutional norms isn't seen as a virtue anymore. A highly mobilized base actually views it as a glaring weakness.
Which makes this next detail seriously counterintuitive. Cornyn's campaign relentlessly attacked Paxton's totally unprecedented level of personal and legal baggage. We are talking about a 2023 impeachment by the Republican-led Texas House, a decade-long felony securities fraud indictment that was eventually dismissed, and a highly politicized divorce. Cornyn's allies poured millions into arguing that nominating a guy with this much baggage was a massive risk. And yet, Paxton won in a landslide anyway. How does that happen?
It comes down to a fascinating psychological mechanism. The voters actually reframed all of that extensive baggage. They didn't see it as disqualifying flaws. They saw it as proof that he's a resilient target of the establishment. There's this incredible quote from a supporter that perfectly captures the mood. He always lands on his feet, like Trump. The controversies were literally viewed as proof that he was surviving a system that the base feels is out to get them. It completely neutralized millions of dollars in negative attack ads.
Now, you might be thinking this was just a weird anomaly localized to one specific race, but the data says otherwise. Look at the highly contested runoff to replace Paxton as Attorney General. Self-funded candidate MAGA Mayes Middleton just defeated Chip Roy, a prominent, deeply conservative congressman, by taking 56.2% of the vote. This proves we aren't just looking at a one-off fluke. We are looking at a structural paradigm shift reshaping the entire ballot.
And what's crazy about Chip Roy losing is that it didn't hinge on policy differences at all. Roy is a prominent member of the Freedom Caucus. He has an aggressively right-wing platform. But Middleton hammered him for past statements criticizing Donald Trump on January 6th and for endorsing Ron DeSantis in 2024. Roy's defeat confirms a really stark reality. Deviation from Trump on literally any level is now politically fatal in these environments. Personal loyalty has officially eclipsed policy alignment.
When you zoom out, you see this isn't just happening in Texas either. Just 10 days earlier, Senator Bill Cassidy was decisively defeated in Louisiana's Republican primary. A similar structural filter was at play. Louisiana just dismantled its open jungle primary in favor of a closed party primary, locking out the moderate crossover voters. Whether you're looking at the closed primary in Louisiana or the low turnout runoff in Texas, we are witnessing a systematic cleansing of institutionalist lawmakers.
But here is where this whole dynamic hits a massive wall called the general election. While Republicans were locked in this expensive, bruising primary fight, the Democratic nominee, progressive populist James Talarico, just absolutely shattered records. He pulled in $27 million in his first quarter haul. Compare that to Paxton and Cornyn, who raised a combined $2.5 million in that same period. The newly minted Republican nominee is now facing a massive cash deficit, and national Republicans might have to divert over $100 million to defend what has historically been a very safe seat.
Because the audience is about to change, and so do the incentives. Talarico is already framing Paxton as a uniquely vulnerable target for suburban moderates, while Paxton's allies are betting that the deep conservative lean of the state will naturally insulate them. So the ultimate tension hanging over all of this is pretty simple. The uncompromising combat-focused energy that dominates a primary clearly wins the nomination, but can that exact same insurgency scale to win over millions of moderate suburbanites in November?
An investment in knowledge pays the best interest, so why not invest in this channel? Click like and subscribe for more.